In the tapestry of life, where every thread holds a story, America in black and white emerges as a haven for the voices echoing through the heart of our communities. In this podcast, we wade through the rivers of our collective experiences, celebrating the vibrant hues of change brought forth by the whispers of hope and the roars of action. It's more than just a conversation. It's a journey into the heart of our society, illuminated by the light of those daring to dream and do. Join us, and let your voice be the melody that guides us toward a dawn where every color finds its place in the masterpiece of our shared destiny. Together, let's paint a future brimming with the positives that dwell in our minds and the actions that shape our world.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of America in Black and White. I am your host, Charles King. I want you to sit with something for just a moment before we begin. Imagine living in a country where the way you love the person you love, the truth of who you are, is not just frowned upon, not just culturally stigmatized, but written into law as a criminal offense. Imagine that the state, the very institution built to protect you, has been handed the authority inherited from a colonial power that no longer even enforces these laws in its own country to arrest you, try you, and imprison you for up to 15 years for the crime of being yourself. Now imagine that you know this, that you carry this knowledge in your body every single day, and that you still wake up in the morning and choose to advocate, to recognize, to speak, to defend, to build, not because you are unafraid, but because the fear of staying silent is greater than the fear of speaking out. That is not a metaphor. For LGBTQ plus Zambians, and for LGBTQ plus Africans across the continent, that is a daily reality in 2026. Tonight's guest does not live in the comfort of abstraction. He lives in the complexity of consequence, and in that environment where HIV stigma continues to claim lives long before the virus itself reaches critical stage, where climate change is reshaping livelihoods on a continent that has contributed the least to the warming of this planet, where young people are being simultaneously left behind economically and locked out digitally in the middle of all that. He has chosen to stand up every single day. Here in America, we sometimes speak about Africa and the African continent as if it is a distant chapter in our story, as if the Middle Passage drew a line in the ocean that separated us into two different narratives. But it did not. The colonial systems that kidnapped African people and enslaved them on American soil are the same colonial systems that partitioned the African continent at the Berlin Conference in 1884, that extracted its resources, suppressed its languages, rewrote its history, and left behind borders designed to divide and laws designed to oppress. The wound is the same. The wound is the same wound. The struggle is the same struggle. And the resistance, the extraordinary unbroken line of Black resistance that runs from Frederick Douglass to Harriet Tubman to Fannie Lou Hamer to the freedom fighters of South Africa to the democracy organizers of West Africa to the human rights defenders of East and Central Africa, that resistance is the same resistance. Africa's sons and daughters have never stopped rising. Organizers, thinkers, builders, freedom fighters, people who looked at everything stacked against them and refused, absolutely refuse to let those systems have the final word. Tonight's guest is one of those people, born on the soil of the continent that gave humanity its first breath. He carries that inheritance not as a burden, but as a mandate. What you're about to witness tonight is rare. This is not a conversation about Africa filtered through the lens of suffering, charity, or crises. This is a conversation about leadership, about innovation, about courage, about community, about what it looks like when a young Black man refuses to wait for permission to decide and decides instead to build the institution that his community needs. Tonight's episode is a window into the human rights landscape of sub-Saharan Africa that most people, even people who care deeply, have never had the privilege of seeing clearly. We're going to talk about HIV response and what genuine health equity requires when stigma and criminalization are working against treatment simultaneously. We are going to talk about LGBTQ plus rights and what advocacy looks like when the law is the adversary. We're going to talk about climate justice and why Africa's crises is the world's moral emergency. We're going to talk about digital justice and why internet access is not a luxury, but a human right. We're going to talk about economic empowerment and what it means to insist that Black communities be not just invited to development conversations, but resourced to lead them. And we're going to talk about youth leadership because all of this is being carried by a man in the prime of his youth who decided that the future could not wait. This is one of the most important conversations we have had on this show, and I am honored that you are here for it. Tonight's guest is a human rights advocate, an LGBTQ plus rights defender, a climate justice activist, and a social entrepreneur whose work is reshaping what is possible for marginalized communities in Zambia and across the African continent. He is the co-founder and executive director of Access Horizons Initiative, a youth-led organization working at the bold and necessary intersection of human rights, public health, digital justice, economic empowerment, and climate resilience. His life's work is a refusal, a daily deliberate, courageous refusal to accept that the communities he serves should have to choose between their identity and their safety, between their health and their dignity, between survival today and justice tomorrow. He is joining us tonight from the continent that is the cradle of all humanity, and he is brilliant, and he is brave, and he is here. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to America in Black and White, the extraordinary Benjamin Hyson Mutambo. Welcome to the show, sir.
Hello. How are you doing?
I'm doing just excellent. How are you?
I'm lovely. Lovely. Good morning. I don't know if it's good morning, good evening. What are we doing? Good evening.
So, is there anything you'd like to say to the audience before we get into the show?
Sure. I'm so excited for this platform. I feel like this is one of the rare platforms. We don't get such opportunities, especially down south here in Southern Africa, in Zambia, to actually be able to speak freely, because we always feel many a time our voices are controlled. Our voices are usually scrutinized whenever we get to speak about it in the public space, being the Zambian eye of this public space. But being offered an international platform like this to actually have conversations which we're going to have, it excites me, because it's going to be raw, it's going to be exciting, and one thing is going to be honest. So thank you so much for having me on this platform, and I look forward for any questions that you may have with regards to my context, living here in Zambia, in Africa, being an LGBT plus person, LGBTQ plus person living in Zambia and Africa. So thank you so much. So I'll give it back to you.
Yes, well, we welcome you, and I want to thank you for being here. I also want to thank all of our audience for watching. That is those that are no matter where you are. I appreciate you as well as all of our normal supporters that are here. We appreciate you so much, and I hope you guys enjoy this show like you do the others. So, what I want to do first, Ben, is I want to start with where I get the audience let the audience have an opportunity to get to know a lot about you and who you are before we get into all of the great things that you're doing. And I want to start this off, and I call this "The Man from Zambia: Life Story and Origins."
Okay.
So with this, I want you to start at the very beginning, not the organization, not the advocacy work, not the titles and expertise, just the boy. Where did you grow up in Zambia? What was your world like? What did your childhood teach you about what is right, what is wrong, and what is worth fighting for?
Okay. I mean, that's a very interesting question. I think I'm gonna tackle it this way. So I grew up in Zambia, of course, like you've mentioned. I was born in Chipata, Zambia, which is on the eastern province of the country. Beautiful place, by the way. But I don't recommend growing up there being black, gay, and economically disempowered. Um, it's a very, very tricky situation in the sense of where when you grow up in a very staunch religious family, you get to live your life based off their perception. So I grew up in a way that I wouldn't call it in a horrible way, but I grew up in a beautiful way from an amazing family, very loving family. But at some point, I needed to recognize who I was and what I stood for. But that was so difficult because at the end of the day, we always have this running joke amongst my circle of friends to say, "Don't be black, gay, and poor. Don't be, don't be." I shit you not, because those intersectional lies will literally screw up your life at the end of the day. Because at the end of the day, being marginalized on all fronts will do you such a disadvantage on your life that you end up feeling as if your life amounts to nothing. So, what I'm trying to say basically is that I grew up in a loving home. Yes, great. As I grew older, I realized I came into my own pretty much, and I started to realize that this is who I was, and this is who I should not be. And at the end of the day, I decided to think to myself that how do I come out with my family? That was a difficult situation. Already the law is against us. That's for one. The law is against us. My family is against that best of the religious practice and the doctrine that they believe in. So it was a very interesting time growing up. And I believe that I really don't know how I got through it, eh? Because I think, if I remember correctly, it was a thing of just pretty much just pushing forward, waiting for a moment when I actually got my economic independence, where I could actually just say, you know what, this is who I am, and this is what I'm gonna do with the rest of my life. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. Um, a couple of years ago, I had a weirdly disturbing experience where someone who I thought was a close friend of mine decided to out me to my family. And at the time, I was being economically supported by my family. And that led to my family withdrawing the economic support from me. And subsequently, I was taken into conversion therapy, and the rest is history. I will not delve down too much into that because at the end of the day, we don't wanna give the audience an emotional roller coaster ride. You know what I mean? But what I will say is that it was an interesting time growing up in Zambia, especially witnessing queer people like myself, witnessing the law being weaponized against us politically, socially, religiously, culturally. I think one of the things that interests me the most about living in Zambia is that the law itself doesn't have a leg to stand on. Culture itself doesn't have a leg to stand on. Religion itself doesn't have a leg to stand on, because at the end of the day, everything is in conflict with each other. So now you start to wonder to yourself, thinking that at what point do these ideologies reach an intersectional aspect to say, When do we recognize humanism? When do you recognize humanity? When do we recognize empathy in order to accommodate certain members of our community without leaving anyone else behind? And which is strange. We've got so many freedoms in my country. I mean, same like the US, we've got so many freedoms in my country. But the difference is certain freedoms in my country contradict each other. Certain cultural freedoms contradict each other. There's certain cultural practices which are allowed by law, allowed by society, allowed by culture. But it's strange to say. It's strange to think that there's a huge bias and there's a huge bigotry around that, surrounding all that ideologies. In the sense that certain ideologies are accepted culturally and certain ideologies are not accepted culturally. Living as a gay man, living as a lesbian woman, living as a trans person in Zambia is frowned upon legally, socially, culturally, religiously. But it makes you wonder to say, why are certain aspects of our social living, our cultural living, also scrutinized in the way that LGBTQ plus persons are living their lives? I will talk about things like, for example, things that are basic things that are in our constitution: theft, murder. We'll look at things like infidelity, and so on and so forth. These things are not scrutinized in the way that the individual living, the individual context of who someone is scrutinized. And it's so shocking to find out, to realize and grow up in this country to find out that politicians actually weaponize the ignorance of the masses to gain votes from the populace, pretty much weaponizing downtrodden people, using their economic disadvantagedness, using that, for example, using the level of education, using the level of misinformedness. And Zambia is one of the few places in Africa which actually has used religion and constitutionalized religion, brought it into the constitution, and now you find government leaders, politicians have actually now started to use weaponized religion in order to suppress voices. We're going to be having an election, on the 13th of August this year, and so far so good. But I've been worried in the past, especially in the 2021 elections, where public speakers, politicians who are aspiring for the presidency have used LGBTQ people for the purpose of securing votes amongst the conservatives. So yeah, that's a little bit about myself.
So, Zambia is a country of extraordinary complexity, a nation that gained its independence in 1964 that has navigated colonialism's aftermath, HIV climate pressures, and economic inequalities. So, hold on one second here, please. And so, with that, and with the most courageous voices, growing up there, what did it feel like to be a young person watching your country navigate all of that? And when did you understand that you were going to be someone who tried to change something?
Okay. Growing up in Zambia, like I mentioned, we're being bombarded with truths of, for example, our founder Kenneth Kaunda, our truth of humanism, patriotism, of empathy. I mean, Zambia's fight for independence was one of tragedy where a lot of lives were lost. That was way before my time, of course. But growing up in Zambia, we grew up with these stories, these fundamental stories of freedom fighters, the humanism that they preached, the empathy that they preached around culture and tribe. Because Zambia is one country which has not necessarily healed from tribalism and ethnic. The ethnic diversity that exists in Zambia, because Zambia is a country with 72 tribes, and this is one thing that our founder actually preached: one Zambia, one nation. But I don't think at any point they say one Zambia, one nation minus the LGBTQ people. But it's so strange that growing up in Zambia, we started to realize that by we, I mean my community, and other people who are marginalized, people living with disabilities, people who are people who are differently abled. I apologize. We started to realize that one Zambia, one nation doesn't necessarily mean being included into the whole holistic nature of what the country preaches about one Zambia, one nation. We do understand that there's legislature around that. We do understand and appreciate that legislature surrounds the whole systematic um, running of the country. But at what point do we actually start to interrogate who someone is, who someone should be, and what one Zambia, one nation should be? Because at the end of the day, someone being gay, lesbian, trans, queer, bisexual, whatnot, doesn't make them any less Zambian. And growing up in Zambia, I grew up in the age of social media. You get sentiments on social media saying things like, oh, you're this, you're that, you're queer, you're gay, you're lesbian, and you're whatever. How about you leave the country and be gay or lesbian or trans elsewhere? Which is very strange. This is not the humanity. This is not the humanism that Kenneth Kaunda preached. Because at the end of the day, when you say one Zambia, one nation, everyone is included in that mantra, no? But that's not a mantra we're living by. We're living by a religious construct, a culture construct that many of us don't actually understand. And a lot of the time, there's a whirlwind which is being pushed by anti-right movements, which a few politicians sit around that who push the agenda of anti-rights in the country, anti-human rights, anti-LGBTQ rights towards the masses. And it's so unfortunate that the masses are not as informed that they should be, and they carry that information with them, and before we know it, they radicalize that information. And living in a black majority country is one of the I would say this in as brutally honestly as I can. Being black gay in Zambia is hard because not only are you in a black majority country which lacks the diversity that a Western society should have to accommodate divergent views, because most of our views in Zambia are homogeneous. Conservativeness, being religious, being humble, as most political aspirants like to call it, being of the faith. So growing up in Zambia felt like a chore, pretty much. It felt like you need to live each and every day fighting for your life internally within yourself, wondering at what point will I be found out, at what point will I be caught out, and what happens to me when I get caught out, what happens to me when I get found out. Our penal code does not necessarily vindicate or legislate against homosexual relationships, being the identity of being gay, the identity of being lesbian, the identity of being trans. Our penal code does not legislate against that. What our penal code does legislate against that is what they call the unnatural act of same sex sex, pretty much. But it's so strange that even through the legislature, through political aspirants, through your councillors and your political leaders, no one ever bothers to educate the masses on what the law actually prescribes as a crime. So you live your life thinking that Ben, am criminal, pretty much. So now at what point, as Ben is growing up, 13, 14 years, 15, 16 years old, who understands very little of the law, does someone come to me or someone publicize the fact that my existence is not a crime? I will touch on the fact that later on, of course, as we continue this conversation, to say same-sex relations is under the penal code, but the identity of belonging to a certain sexual minority is not a crime. But that's one distinction that a majority of our populace in Zambia fails to understand. You would find sentiments from people saying people who are queer, lesbian, gay, and whatnot, LGBTQ, should be arrested based off their identity. And then I wonder to myself, um, through each and every step of civic education that every single Zambian has gone through, at what point was this information relayed to them saying identity is not a crime? It's the same sex relations that is a crime, which is also a very, how can I put it? It's also a very, I remember you had mentioned earlier on to say these are laws that we inherited from the British Empire at the time when Zambia and Northern Rhodesia at the time was a colony of the British Empire. We inherited those laws. Meanwhile, our colonial masters have revised those laws and have adopted new laws to accommodate the growing diversity in their nations. Meanwhile, we've kept those laws and regulations and the principles and the cultural nuances and so on. So, in a nutshell, growing up in Zambia was it was a steep climb.
Well,
It was a steep climb.
what I
Go
was
on
just
now.
listening is that it sounds like about a lot that what happens here in the U.S. as well, and that is, for whatever reasons, in using the Bible as you say. I mean, now that's one of the things that these politicians do, but that's not written into what they do into the Constitution, whatever have you. Even though it says clearly that you're supposed to separate church and state, but some
Mm.
people use that anyway, and it's like it's this crying wolf thing when it comes to that. Now, what it sounds like to me, and it seems like a little bit of a comparison, because some of the things that you were mentioning before, like the conversion therapy and all those other things, that has happened here in some places here in the US. It still happens. Now,
Mhm.
what I would always think, and we're not going to bring religion into this, but I do want to say this, is that if those folk actually read the Bible, then I think they would know that they're committing the very sin against the Bible in which the Bible speaks. But
That is that is so true. That
but
is so true. I guess maybe we, and I'm gonna use the word we very loosely in the sense of where like we feel like we've got a God-given mandate to carry out the rules and legislation and the laws of God. And it's very, very unfair in the sense of where we place ourselves at the center of judgment and being the carriers and the executioners of the law. Meanwhile, if someone is as religious and at Christ-like as they would like to think they are, why would you be the executioner and the judge and executioner of the laws of God? But anyway, like we said, we'll live religion for later on, possibly, because that's a very, how can I put it? It's a very touchy conversation for a lot of black folk like us, and you know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, a lot of black folk really use religion as a foundation and a stepping stone for who they are, who they're gonna be, and who they should be.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So your human rights advocacy, especially for the LGBTQ plus rights defense in a country where the law itself is used as a weapon against queer people, is not just professionally risky; it can be personally dangerous. When did you first know that this was your path? And was there a moment, a person, an experience that crystallized your commitment to this work?
Oh, of course, of course, of course. I mean, apart from my conversion therapy itself, I already knew who I was at the time. I already, even prior to, I already knew who I was. But I've had a couple of incidences where I step out of my home and go into public spaces, and maybe based off how I'm interacting with certain people, I've experienced violence around that, verbal violence. I've experienced someone pushing and pulling me around, telling me that, well, in vernac, of course, telling me that people like me shouldn't exist and we should be murdered. You know what I mean? So I think incidences like that have actually helped me, actually given me the strength to say, we shouldn't live like this. But it's hard being an advocate in Zambia because, in as much as certain incidences like that have happened to you, but who do you actually channel the advocacy to? Because the government is against you, the society is against you, the
Mhm.
culture is against you.
Yep.
So, I mean, in as much as you're advocating for that, the advocacy comes from a place of where, even if I'm advocating to a person next to me, I'm going to do it from a point of empathy, not from a point of legislature, because they'll not know what I'm talking about. So, I guess to answer your question, I knew that this was my path when I'd experienced all these different things in my life: verbal violence, physical violence, and also the conversion therapy. I knew this was my path because I felt that no one needs to live, no one deserves to live like this. No one deserves to be victimized for the rest of their lives based off who they are. It's very strange to say when people always think that being queer, being LGBTQ is something that you can wake up one morning and say like, oh, okay, I'm not gonna be gay anymore. You know what I mean? But then the opposite is also true. Like, okay, but in a country like Zambia, who would want to wake up in a country like Zambia and think like, okay, I'm gonna wake up gay or lesbian today and continue to be victimized? You know what I mean? Who would choose victimization out of peace and comfort that comes with assimilating and pretty much just conforming to the culture and society of what my country provides? Yeah.
So let's get a little bit more deeper into your advocacy work. And this part I want to talk more about the LGBTQ rights, the advocacy in Zambia, your courage under law. For our audience who may not know, let's be clear about the legal landscape. Same-sex relations in Zambia are criminalized under colonial penal code, carrying penalties up to 15 years in prison. You're an LGBTQ rights defender operating in that environment. I want you to help us to understand, what does it actually feel like to do this work in this country with this law on the books, not abstractly, but what does it feel like in your body, in your daily fire?
Oh, that's a doozy, hey? Okay, so I will say, when it comes to advocacy, right, we have an understanding with the principal lawmakers, as we like to call them, to say, in as whatever realm or whatever sector of advocacy that we're doing, whether it's health rights, economic empowerment, climate justice, we have an understanding, an unwritten understanding, an unwritten hearing to say we will not call it that. We would call it, I remember this just changed recently, the term just changed recently. We used to call it key populations. Key populations pretty much was female sex workers, people who inject drugs, men who have sex with men, prisoners, and so on and so forth. So the term just recently changed, and now they're calling us marginalized people, marginalized communities, or whatever the public health term is now these days. So pretty much now, advocacy for us every single day of our lives is not really advocacy to say we're advocating for LGBTQ rights. We've masked the idea of LGBTQ rights under the umbrella of human rights, pretty much. In as much as we've got an HIV pandemic in Zambia here, when our first interventions around HIV in Zambia started, we masked it under public health rights, which the government was very much aware of this. The government has always been aware of the work that advocates, human rights defenders are doing in Zambia with regards to LGBTQ rights. We've always been aware. But the thing is that society is not aware of that. So whenever we caught out to say a certain safe space or wellness center exists in a certain community, and then one, two, three, four, five people on social media feel as if the government is in support of LGBTQ rights service provision, the government is aware. And the thing is that because everything is under the guise of public health, universal access to human rights, which our government conforms to, So every single day is a journey because we don't know exactly at what point in time when the tides will change for, because now our our LGBTQ rights advocacy, which I mentioned earlier on to say is now under the guise of human rights, will now become a pariah topic because our society has got a habit of nitpicking which parts of the broader human rights should be and should not be allowed. So I guess on a day-to-day basis, it's hard because there's a lot of safety and security concerns which we need to, of course, be aware of. You need to be aware of your language. You need to be aware of your verbatim. You need to be aware of who you say it to, what you say, how you tell her the message, and for how long the message should go on for. So, I mean, the fact that a lot of our health system is supported, was supported by PEPFAR initiatives, which were USA, formerly USAID, CDC, and so on and so forth. I guess it helped a lot the fact that through these initiatives, LGBTQ rights were being advocated silently through public health. And it's unfortunate right now because of a lot of funding cuts, a lot of reinfections are now going on around in our communities, and a lot of human rights advocacy has been lost because that was our shield. That was our shield. We could advocate for human rights. We could advocate for LGBTQ rights using the shield of no, we're carrying out a USAID mission initiative project. We're carrying out a CDC initiative project, but now it's become increasingly difficult, especially that if one organization partners internationally with, I'll give you an example. Imagine a local civil society organization in Zambia partnering with an organization such as um, Gay Rights Initiative Global. You know what I mean? That sends that sends a radical message already locally, and no bank wants to touch you once they see that you're receiving funding from people like that, because at the end of the day they feel as if um, your initiatives are being pushed by the West. You get what I mean? Like the entirety of your initiatives, the entirety of your programming, the entirety of your strategic interventions is a Western agenda, pretty much. I mean, it's funny because every single day there's always some, most, not really every single day, but most days there's always someone who's always thinking to themselves and maybe pointing fingers to say our advocacy is a Western agenda. And I always think to myself, like, okay, but are you saying even the existence of queer people, LGBTQ people in Zambia and Africa as a whole is a Western agenda? Are these CIA plans who are here to destabilize the democracy, the Christian values of Africa and Black Zambia and conservative Zambia? You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, it sounds like, and you tell me if this is right, but it sounds like what you're saying is that they do allow you guys your advocacy work and maybe to do a protest, but they want to make sure that it's a controlled fight in the advocacy and not like one that's really big and broad that draws an enormous amount of attention, because the more attention that you draw, then that means the more the spotlight is on you, and the government is not going to have that. Is that what that is?
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. So you're given this much of a platform to actually not necessarily advocate for LGBTQ rights, but then you're given that much of a platform to say, okay, you can, in as much as you're designing programs for universal human rights, you can include X amount of people in your programming, and we're gonna give it a ribbon and a, a little red ribbon and tie it on it and say, instead of calling it LGBTQ rights, can we give it a public health term like men who have sex with men, things like that. They will never ever allow you to say LGBTQ in any single space. And Actually, the government policy is actually something that's very, it's very neither here or there, because at the end of the day, whichever presidential aspirant comes into power in that particular moment in time, they'll either diminish LGBTQ rights or they'll silently support it. And when I say silently support it, I mean they'll not say anything at all. Not to say that they'll go behind closed doors and have conversations around this. They will not say anything at all. So we usually take that little sliver of not saying anything at all as some sort of support, because we like to think silence means you're in support of, right? But then we're always in a difficult situation to think that, okay, LGBTQ rights in Zambia, LGBTQ rights in Africa. Okay, we understand that LGBTQ rights in Zambia and Africa do not start here or end there. They are they're ongoing.
So you're saying
But
that they
then,
basically connect everything to the continent as one thing instead of separate for each country.
well, not necessarily. I mean, like Zambia's constitution is a Christian nation, right? I mean, Zambia is only constitutional Christian nation in Africa. So there's another layer towards that. There's another layer towards that. I mean, there's the Africanism at the end of the day. There's the black consciousness at the end of the day to say like, okay, we as black people do not believe in homosexuality. But then there's also the aspect of Zambia as a Christian nation, and now Zambia is a signatory to several human rights and several health acts globally. So now it's always a thing of where how does how does the government, how do we as activists, how do we as civil society organizations tie everything together in the sense of where, like, okay, without taking the fact that Zambia is a Christian nation away from the country itself, but how do we also reach a point of neutrality to say we can still provide this service to A, B, C, D, but still maintain the fact that, okay, we understand that this is a constitutional declaration and this will not be going away anytime soon. It's an interesting conversation. It's a very interesting dynamic once you're on the ground, I promise you.
So,
Yeah.
so tell us, like with all the advocacy work that you're doing and all of the barriers that you face, tell us how does that these things come back to affect you and the people that you advocate for? How does that show up?
I mean, that shows up I mean, at the end of the day, it shows up in so many different aspects: mental health, the rise in HIV cases, the rise in IPV, intimate partner violence, the rise in domestic violence cases, and things like that. And also, just to add another layer to what you've just asked just right now, one of the biggest barriers towards advocacy is resources. I mean, without resources, there's only so much that you can do. I mean, Zambia is such a massive country, in the sense of where you cannot just do advocacy in the urban areas. You need to translate that advocacy into rural areas, into the most untouched areas of the country. But now the fact that there's a lot of barriers around culture, there's a lot of religious barriers, societal barriers that exist around that. So how it translates back to us is that it always feels as if it's a drawback. You can make you can reach 15, 20,000 people in HIV care and human rights service provision and so on and so forth, mental health service provision, sorry. But then before you know it, 2 or 3 weeks from now, there's a policy change, or maybe there's a funding cut, and now you're back to square one. So many people get lost to care, HIV care. Certain people get lost to care towards mental health service provision, and then several people also get lost to the fact that there's certain interventions that were specifically designed for cultural sensitization, so sexual sensitization, but without the resources, it always feels as if it's 2 steps forward, 100 steps backwards. Yeah.
So the laws criminalizing LGBTQ plus identities across much of Africa are not ancient African traditions. They are colonial inheritance, British penal codes imposed on African societies that, in many cases, had for more fluid and
Mm-hmm.
inclusive understandings of gender and sexuality before
Yeah,
colonialization. So, how do you
yeah.
use that historical truth in your advocacy, and how do people respond when they hear it?
Um, that's a very interesting question, actually. I guess maybe what I would say is that history always teaches that society grows through dialogue. I mean, we always have dialogues. We try as not as much as possible to have dialogues within the confines of what we're allowed to do, because remember, it's a closed loop. You can only say as much as the state is allowing you to say, without making yourself become a victim towards the law. So my hope is that Zambia continues to have the conversations, in as much as we're having the conversations through a closed loop, and we are having conversations in the realms of dignity, regardless of who's got different beliefs and whatnot. Um, I will say this: one of the biggest undocumented factors in our country is that we never ever realized to say LGBTQ rights existed in our country prior to colonial rule, prior to, I would like to call it, colonial indoctrination.
That's a great way of saying it because that's putting their culture on you.
Yeah, these things existed in our country way before that, and these are things that undocumented. I mean, I have sat with certain traditional leaders in my country who've said these things exist in our communities. They've always existed, but it's just that we don't talk about them. It was only after those policy that was introduced, now we have to talk about them. And now we have to publicly shun away from them. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, these were unspoken conversations that existed in our black communities. But now, come legislation, come policy, come colonialization, now all these things were put in the spotlight, and now we had to talk about them. We had to identify them and actually shun them away and actually develop legislature against them,
Yes.
which is exactly so. Which is one of the things that Zambia has always historically approached these things in a very subtle way, very, very subtle way. Only until certain radical aspects within the institution, within the machine come into play, do these things actually come into the spotlight of conversation. And many a time, this conversation is usually against our people, against my people, without regarding the fact that these are actually real human beings, real opportunities that they have, real livelihoods, real families. Can I just add one more thing? Sorry.
Yes.
Um, there's always there's always this idea that queer people in Zambia, LGBTQ, whichever letter on the spectrum one belongs to, there's always this idea in Zambia that people live in isolation. You know what I mean? People always forget that person A, person B has got actually a family behind them who are okay with who they are. But the general perception of our country and our continent is that people see us and they feel as if a gay man lives in isolation, a lesbian woman lives in isolation without a parent, without a sibling, without an uncle, without an aunt, and whatnot, which is a very, very unfair perception that we have. So I guess getting back to your question, one of the conversations that we try to have with our communities is to make people realize is that we don't live in isolation. We actually have parents, we have siblings, we have a brother, we have a sister, we have a mother who actually know about us and are okay with it. So I guess at a certain extent, once you can convince the next person to say that this person who is marginalized in society actually has a family structure around them. They've got friends and they've got family who are okay with their identity. Now, how do we translate that being okay about the next person nationally, how do we translate it provincially, how do we translate it culturally, how do we translate it nationally?
So,
Back to you.
but with all that, I mean, because I can tell that you're putting forth the effort in the work that you're doing. But can you tell us
Yeah.
how is it that with them not allowing you to say LGBTQ or gay or things of this nature when
Yeah.
you're actually doing your advocating, how do you, how do you identify as being who you are when you're doing this advocacy work without being able to use those words?
I mean, at the end of the day, I personally would never ever identify myself publicly unless maybe I'm asked by a certain close friend or family.
Okay, okay.
But at the end of the day, we have vernacular nuances that we usually use to actually say to actually help us identify certain people within communities. But these are terms which, and this is a very interesting thing about vernacular, because it can neither mean this or that. It's never really a straightforward response. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, one figurative term can actually mean this or that. So, but I mean, based off how you're phrasing that particular question, the person who you're phrasing it towards will actually be able to understand what you're talking about and who you're referring to. But because you're you're using vernacular to actually address certain terms within our society, somehow it's been okayed. But now, when you translate LGBTQ into the English definition as you and I know it, it becomes a social offense now, which is,
Oh wow.
yeah, interesting.
Yeah, that is you know I tell you, you know, I can say that what most likely what the leaders of your country are saying is that we're not discriminating because we've got advocacy, we have people out doing whatever they do for their rights. But
Yeah,
but in the back doors, in the back rooms, it's like you're not going to
uh,
use that term. If you use that term, that's
no,
offensive, and you are going to go to jail. That's the threat.
exactly, exactly. Exactly, I love what you just said. Like, I remember, it should have been a couple of years ago when we had a women's match in Zambia, a beautiful women's match in Zambia, and of course the community came out in number to support the women, and then of course the community came out in the rainbow flags and trying to show solidarity for women's rights and also trying to show solidarity for themselves. A couple of people actually picked up at the police for the fact that now social media sensationalized the fact that all people came up to this event and now they're showing the LGBTQ and the rainbow flag and things like that. So people were actually arrested for
Oh
that. And
wow.
now, yeah, it's very interesting. Hey, we live in interesting times. And now you start to wonder to yourself to say, like, okay, what law are you using to actually arrest this person? You know what I mean? Like, what is the legislative backing that you're actually using to apprehend this person and actually um, put them behind bars days on end without a trial, without any conviction, without like it doesn't make sense, you know? And that's like I always say that usually things like this always come from a political directive. They always come from a societal directive. Someone somewhere is not happy about advocacy, about a certain way that advocacy was happened, and now they feel as if this is gonna hamper their political aspirations. So it's interesting, I would say. But anyway, we are always trying to figure out ways of how, not as much as we're advocating for LGBTQ, right? We're always trying to figure out ways on how we can actually advocate for this without necessarily advocating for it, if you know what I mean.
Right.
In a way, silent advocacy. Can we have these conversations without actually necessarily having to talk about them, but at the same time realizing that you and I both know that this exists, but can we talk about it without actually talking about it?
Yes.
You get what I mean?
That's the code.
Yeah,
That's the coded language. You just get the
exactly.
read for the body language and the gestures and the things of that
Exactly.
nature. So that's how you move in silence.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a very, it's one of those things. which at the end of the day, we always think to ourselves that will it get better? Not right now. Is it going to get any worse? Depends who's in power. I mean, look at it this way. Just a few years ago, I think that should have been, if I remember the years quite correctly, 2021, 2022. We had a US ambassador by our late president, Edgar Lungu, who was ousted from the country because that should have been Ambassador Foot, last name Foot, who was ousted from the country because he felt that the apprehension of two gay men who were caught in the act and were sentenced to a 15 years prison sentence. And he spoke against that. And then the president at the time felt that this is something that was not the business of the State Department, the US ambassador, and whatnot. And then before we knew it, this ambassador was kicked out of the country. So it's always things like this because at the end of the day, when I think about it critically like that, I don't think this person, I don't think Ambassador Foot was kicked out of the country based off his radical views, but because of how his views would actually sensationalize the Zambian community, the Zambian society, pretty much, yeah.
So, the LGBTQ plus community in Zambia does not exist in isolation. Its members are also young people, women, HIV positive individuals, climate vulnerable community members, people navigating poverty and exclusion in multiple dimensions at once. Can you tell us how does that intersectionality shape how you design programs and advocacy through Access Horizons initiative, and what does it mean to serve someone at the intersection of multiple forms of marginalization simultaneously?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, actually. Usually when interventions are designed, we designed with people in mind. Um, a lot of the time, because most of our work is donor supported, most of our work is donor funded and partner affiliated. So you would find that certain interventions only speak to certain target groups. The intersectionalities only exist where the resources allow it to exist, if I was to say that. Because at the end of the day, we do have a lot of cross transmission between several communities in our country. But then you might find that a certain donor will only expect you to design programs and interventions, for example, towards men who have sex with men. They will not want you to touch target groups like female sex workers and people who use drugs and things like that. And then they'll leave those target groups to another partner, another affiliate who will take up the mantle of providing services to those communities. So the intersectionalities usually occur when Access Horizons is able to speak to another civil society organization to actually be able to understand or co-design programs or co-implement projects to actually figure out, okay, if civil society A is designing interventions around this target group, and my civil society organization is designing interventions against another target groups. How do we come together to actually make sure that the two communities, there's no cross transmission, especially around HIV, and also how can we come together in the sense of where um, how can we come together in the sense of where there's certain marginalizations that happen between several segments of our communities are not all occurring at once. I'll give an example. A lesbian woman who's a sex worker who uses drugs, who might be a prisoner.
Oh, wow.
I think it's a very interesting dynamic in the sense of where actually it also applies to men who have sex with men, gay men. You can be a gay man. You use drugs. Maybe you're HIV positive. You're a person living with HIV at the end of the day, and also you're a sex worker. So now all those intersectionalities, how do we design interventions to actually cater for all those different intersectional aspects of this person's lived reality? And that's where collaboration comes in. So as Access Horizons, pretty much, we love the idea of collaboration. What is the next person doing, and how they're doing it, and how can we collaborate with them? If the next person's niche is around sex workers, how do we take a gay man who's receiving treatment services or referral services from us and link them towards an organization that's providing services specifically tailor-made for sex workers? How do we do that? So we come together, we sit together and actually come up with programs and interventions, and we sit with our donors and our partners and our funder affiliates to actually say, okay, there's a lot of cross transmission that's going on within these communities. How can we come together and sit and design programs that actually help everyone? Because I mean, at the end of the day, our communities do not sit in isolation. Our community, you can be a married gay man married to a woman who has sex with other men, who is also our target group, but then um, you're also a sex worker. You know, it's a very complex dynamic that we have in our country, and I think this is not something that's unique to Zambia. I feel like this is something that's globally recognized, to say like there's a lot of intersectionalities that exist within several segments of our community. And I also just want to add something to say like I mean, LGBT people have always existed in Zambia, and we've heard so many stories which have remained invisible. And based off that fact, then came legal sanctions to actually suppress all these stories, the oral traditions that we've heard around our communities. And Zambia, in its own, created how can I call it? Zambia created wars for these conversations to stop happening.
Society has
Society
created
has
all.
created wars to stop happening.
So now
So now
it's always an
it's always an
interesting
interesting thing
how
how among us activists to say, like, how do we tell the person who lives in the most rural part of the country about what Access Horizons is doing? Ac- Because ideally, what the Access Horizons is doing is illegal and should be reprimanded by the government, or should be stopped by the law. So it's hard work. I will say that it's hard work, but
Oh,
yeah,
I can believe that that's hard work because when you actually have to get data that you've got to compile, put it together, and break it down into groups and
yeah.
sections and so forth. I mean, that's got to be huge, especially for a country of your size. And so to think about the advocacy work, though, just in general, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's just a segment; it's still going to be a large population. So that's a lot of work.
That is a lot of work indeed. That is a lot of work indeed, because I mean, a quarter of our population is rural, and a quarter of our population has never had access to anything to do with digital justice or climate justice. They know nothing about that. So now the challenges that we face as an organization is that how do we actually disseminate that information towards rural communities in the country? And I'll go back to what I said, is that advocacy requires resources, whether it's financial resources, um, technical expertise, equipment, and so on and so forth. Advocacy requires resources, and I don't think there's an advocate in the world who would actually say like, okay, I'll just advocate without any resources being backed by it, because that's not true. Maybe it might be different living in a first world country and being able to advocate for certain things like that, but living in a country like mine, advocacy requires resources. Advocacy requires protection. And in a country like Zambia, protection comes in the form of money.
Right.
If you don't have if you don't have money, you will not be able to protect yourself from the law. Once the law, in as much as people might try misinterpret the law just to try squeeze you for the little that you have as an organization. But here we are, we're fighting, and we're hoping that tomorrow is a brighter day. And yeah, And also, if you can allow me just talk about climate justice a little
We
bit.
hadn't got to that part yet.
Oh, okay. My bad. Okay, go on, go on.
Just so what I want to do next is I want to go to the HIV response in public health and the fight against the stigma. That's why I want to go next.
Hmm.
Um,
Sure.
Zambia carries one of the highest HIV burdens in sub-Saharan Africa,
Yeah.
with the prevalence rates that disproportionately affect young people, women, and LGBTQ plus individuals. You've been working in HIV response as part of your broader advocacy. Walk us through what that work actually looks like on the ground. Who are the people you're reaching, and what are you putting in their hands?
Okay. Because, like I mentioned, so like HIV is a complex illness in the sense of where like it's very intersectional. What we're placing in their hands, pretty much information. Right now, there's a beautiful rollout of PrEP that's going on in the country, and when we talk about HIV, it's important to realize that it's not only a medical issue; it's a social problem. On the ground, our work is pretty much reaching people who often are affected by on the sides of the margin, stigma and discrimination, who lack access to information and healthcare services and support. We give them support without the fear of judgment. Also, we give them the tools, which is pretty much knowledge and information. The people who we pretty much engage, especially when it comes to our outreach services. These are people who go out in the field to disseminate this information and knowledge to our communities. We equip them with the knowledge of condoms, PrEP, access to ART, which is pretty much free. Our government right now has struck several deals with major health providers and major non-governmental health providers to actually provide these services for free. So now the challenge is now has always been how do we disseminate this information to communities that do not realize that this information actually exists. For young people, it's pretty much just ensuring that we are aware, designing campaigns that actually speak to young people, because age is a age is a demographic. It's a huge demographic, and it's a very important demographic that we cannot overlook. At the end of the day, messaging that can reach people my age would not be able to reach people who are 18, 16, 17, and so on and so forth. So I guess designing information, designing knowledge to reach people like that is something that's very, very important to us. Equipping people with the right tools, and I know you're gonna be angry with me when I speak about digital justice, but maybe that's something I can touch on when we get to digital justice, because at the end of the day, when it comes to information dissemination, when we come to equipping our communities on the ground, it's pretty much information, knowledge, and tools, and also physical tools like condoms, PrEP, um, as being able to refer someone to STI screening, being able to provide someone with ART, or link them to services or providers that provide ART. I think in the best way possible, that's the most that we can do right now, apart from the already existing advocacy that's going on right now. Yeah.
I gotta say, but a lot of people that don't do advocacy work, and I know that, it's like they can only imagine. But I want to tell you that I think for the work that you're doing, because I know the advocacy work, how it's being done here in the States, is that
Yeah.
that work is like it's like day in and day out, and it seems like it's 35/8, not 24/7. Because
Exactly.
it just goes on and on and on. When you think about, especially when we talk about the HIV rate, that's there in Zambia. Um, what are some of the things other than when you guys go out and you get people on PrEP and you get people with condoms, and you do the STI screenings, STD screenings. But other than those things, what are some of the other things that you guys are doing? Are you trying to implement to get this rate under control to stop the spread? What are some of the other things you guys are doing?
Okay, that's a beautiful question. I love that question actually. Um, I guess maybe I was. It comes from the fact like you had brought up something very beautiful earlier on when we talk about the economics around HIV. When we talk about the economics around HIV, a lot of people are engaging into. I hate to use this term, but how can I say it? Destructive behaviors around HIV.
Bad
No, no,
practices.
I'm sorry.
Bad practices.
Yeah, exactly. So now at the end of the day, we find ourselves discussing issues like that because certain people are finding themselves in these practices because of their position economically. So now there's a lot of organizations, especially in Zambia, which actually deal with economics empowerment skills that provide certain segments of our communities with skills and pretty much job opportunities so to deter them from those behaviors. Because at the end of the day, we've linked the fact that certain HIV, certain people who contract HIV is linked to certain aspects of being economically disadvantaged. And it's also been linked to the fact that certain people simply did not have the information, which is where digital justice comes in. To a certain extent, how do we ensure that everybody, when information is disseminated, how do we ensure that it's justly disseminated? How do we ensure that the programming and the structure of that information applies to everyone, not just to a certain segment of the population, but to everyone? We need it to speak in literally different languages, because at the end of the day, when we talk about information being disseminated in English, so then someone from the rural area who's never ever heard an English word will not understand what I'm referring to. And also economic empowerment. I mean, there's a lot of I'm gonna shoot myself in the foot by saying this now. Okay, there's a lot of, like, we're gonna call it behaviors.
Right.
There's certain aspects of our community, and I will specifically talk about sex work. I do not frown upon sex work. Just a disclaimer: I do not frown upon sex work, and I mean, like, sex work done rightly is work. That's my motto. But then, in a country like mine where sex work is illegal, you find a lot of stigma and discrimination, especially when sex workers go to health facilities to access health services. They're discriminated against. So
Wow.
now, how do you it's very, very true. Sex workers in Zambia are discriminated against. There's a huge stigma and discrimination, not only by healthcare facilities, but by healthcare providers as well.
Dang.
There has been several interventions by organizations like University of Maryland, Baltimore under the Circuits Project, Advance Project, and also organizations like CIDAS under the Checkup Project, who've tried to design sensitivity trainings for healthcare providers to allow them to be able to accommodate certain people within the wider scope of the community and give them equal access to health services. So it's one of we still struggle as a country, because those are aspects which are culturally and socially ingrained in these people. Because we need to realize the fact that this person is not just a healthcare provider. They belong to a certain sect within our community, within our society, within our culture. So they carry those values into their profession. And in as much as they're administering care to certain members of our community, they administer care and healthcare services based off the values that they believe in. So now, how do we break down those values? Not necessarily breaking them down, but making a hole in the wall for a level of understanding, a level of acceptance, a level of inclusivity, to make someone feel as if to make someone feel safe enough to be able to access those services at these places. Yeah. Back to you.
Wow. So with that, I mean, like, how are they getting away with this kind of discrimination when healthcare is a right?
That's a very interesting question. Someone once said something to me very profound. Uh, a fish rots from the head, right?
Okay.
So when you have policy at high level that does not speak towards inclusivity and doesn't speak against stigma and discrimination, the trickle down effect
Yes.
is all the way towards the bottom.
Yes. Okay.
If, as a medical practitioner or a healthcare provider, your ministry, where you sit at, where you provide these healthcare services, does not speak towards stigma and discrimination, and your ministry sits at cabinet, and your cabinet sits at the presidency,
Right.
and there's no conversation around stigma and discrimination, it trickles down all the way to the bottom.
Wow. So
All the way to the
HIV and LGBTQ plus identity are deeply intertwined in both the epidemic's epidemiology and its social response.
Mhm.
LGBTQ plus individuals in many African countries face double marginalization. They are excluded from healthcare systems because of their identity and simultaneously blamed for the epidemic spread. How do you dismantle that double barrier in your work?
Oh, that is beautiful. I love that. I love that. Sensitization. I'll put it in one word: sensitization. Having conversations with people, having conversations with communities, having conversations, especially around, and I will be very specific when I say this, especially around gay men. In Zambia, there's still a big misconception to say gay men are the leading cause of HIV, especially around communities in Zambia. Me, no, that's not true. That is not true. So, cultural sensitization, community sensitization, societal sensitization is how we bridge these gaps. Because at the end of the day, we need people to be able to understand that these things do not exist in isolation. And one way that we do that is having community meetings, community support group meetings, which are amazing aspects of outreach and program interventions. Because at the end of the day, when you can have members of the community sit down with you, members of the community being church leaders, traditional leaders, sitting in the same room with you, and them being leaders of their own individual communities, spreading the truth of what the meeting was about, I feel like, I believe that that is one of the strongest ways to actually to dismantle misinformation. Because at the end of the day, if you're able to sit in the room with community leaders, and these are the people who are actually at the front line of misinformation, because at the end of the day, whenever misinformation is being spread in communities, it usually starts from community leaders who actually perpetuate ideologies like that. So we usually target people like that, whether it's chiefs, headmen, well, not the kings and not the kings and so on and so forth, but counselors and people like that to be able to assist us in spreading the right form of information within the communities. It's a very it's a very interesting conversation in the sense of where it's hard to speak about one and leave out the other, because at the end of the day, in as much as one day and want to address the other thing needs to be addressed as well, because there's huge intersectional aspects between the two. I'll give you an example. Men who have sex with men. You can speak about it from a men's support group kind of level, but you cannot. It will be very frowned upon to speak about it in a religious setting.
Oh my God.
So now,
So
how
the
do we
religious sector can decide if you live or die.
exactly? So now, how do we bridge that gap? How do we bring people who
Wow.
believe this and who believe that to actually come together and say, like, okay, this has got nothing to do with belief. It's got nothing to do with your belief system, and we're not trying to dismantle your belief system. We're just trying to create a safe environment for a John, a Peter, a Simon, and whomever to actually be able to access health services.
Mhm.
It's a very hard um, flow to actually be able to sweep two people together into the same space, because at the end of the day, belief system, I believe, is something that's very, very strong, and it's something that a lot of people hold on to for dear life. So now, as we are trying to advocate for intersection of interventions, a lot of policymakers, a lot of clergy people always feel as if you're stepping on their toes. And meanwhile, at the end of the day, this is a huge misconception against HIV prevention, treatment, and transmission, you know? So, how do we actually get to the point of where bringing people, different people from different sectors of society, and giving them a platform to have conversation? You'd find certain members of our society refuse to engage with these more liberal minded people because they feel as if they'll be corrupted in the manner that that belief system allows them to prevail, pretty much. Yeah.
So let's transition over to your topic that you want to get out the most, and we're going to talk about this climate justice, Africa's burden, and Africa's leadership. Climate justice is a relatively newer dimension of your work, but it's the one that have embraced as central. Yet you have
Mhm.
embraced as central. Help our audience to understand the specific relationship between climate change and the communities you serve in Zambia and sub-Saharan Africa. What does climate change actually look like in people's lives, not in parts per million or degrees Celsius, but in food, in water, in livelihoods, and survival?
Okay, that is a great question. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Um, climate change is nothing new to Zambia. I mean, it's a global conversation right now. It's a hot topic right now, and I mean, at the end of the day, you find that marginalized communities in Zambia and the rest of Africa contribute the least towards climate change, but meanwhile, their voices are heard the least. And when we talk about voices being heard the least, when policy reform happens, when policy is being made, when laws are being made, when presidents and politicians are being integrated into governance and presidencies and so on and so forth, there is very little conversations to say, okay, at what point do we give people who are already marginalized based off their sexuality or based off their physical ability, at what point do we actually recognize these people to say that do we actually recognize climate change as a portion of their already existing marginalization? I'll give you an example. There's certain areas in my country where accessing health services is very, very difficult because certain areas in my country are prone to flooding. And it's only been in the last couple of decades when certain these areas have now become flood prone areas. So now how do we link healthcare services to those areas in Zambia which are no longer accessible to the rest of the country because of climate change? How
Right.
do we design policies? How do we drive the conversation towards that? Because at the end of the day, for marginalized communities in Zambia, we always there's a general misconception to say that the government will provide. But meanwhile, the government is not really providing because the government is relying on external partners to actually provide for these marginalized communities. Just 2 years ago, there was a huge conversation, and I'm sure you might have heard about it, about how one of our biggest internal rivers in the country was polluted by a Chinese mining firm.
Yes.
But no one, at no given point in time, did anyone ask to say, like, adolescent young girls and young women, people living with disabilities, um, sex workers, how were they affected by this particular environmental disaster? It's conversations like that we need to be having, And it's a pity that within the structure of our government, our governance pretty much, we do not have advisors who speak for marginalized individuals like that. Because at the end of the day, interventions and strategies are provided and designed holistically without realizing that these interventions need to be tailor-made for different communities. And I'm very passionate about adolescent young girls and young women because they face the biggest brunt of all this. Because Zambia, sorry, go on. Yes.
No, no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. So Zambia is a pretty much Zambia is a traditional society where in a rural setup, women fetch the water from the river on the borehole, bring it back home, and now you find those wells are getting dry, and these women are walking further and further and further away from their homes to be able to get these resources. And in the process of them walking further and further from their homestead, they now get into those behaviors which I had mentioned earlier on, which is maybe sex work. And all these things are surrounding climate change to a point of where there's no deliberate interventions being designed to actually provide services or mitigations around that. We are not doing that. I remember as Access Horizons a few years ago, we had designed interventions around plastic mitigation, plastic pollution in the country. We had done a beautiful intervention around that, but unfortunately, that intervention could not sustain itself because at the end of the day, most of these interventions are resource centered. But as I'm speaking to you right now, there is a huge climate change disaster that's about to happen to Zambia because there is very little social corporate responsibility that our big mining firms are actually putting into place in order to mitigate this for our communities without realizing that these communities are the same people that actually work for the mines. When you look at districts in the central province of Zambia, like Kabwe, which a majority of the water resources are lead contaminated. And these are conversations which the BBC and so on and so forth have carried into the journalism and actually spread the word. But we've never ever heard the government actually speak on this. We've never actually heard of prominent figures within the governance structure speaking against this, speaking about how we're going to actually design interventions and programs to actually mitigate these disasters. Worse off, when you look at LGBTQ people who've lost livelihoods because of climate change, we don't talk about that because these are people who've been deliberately forgotten by the governance structures of our country, governance structures of our society, because according to them, we do not exist, or rather, we do not matter to. We do not. They do not care for us to exist.
Right.
And these are certain conversations which at the end of the day, in as we're heading into a very environmental conscious um, society, but I feel like my country is being left behind deliberately because at the end of the day, when we talk about climate change, it's about getting the money first and worrying about climate change later. And it's very interesting to find that there's a lot of Western agenda that's being pushed onto Zambia to design mitigation, to design interventions around climate change. But meanwhile, the same agendas that are being pushed onto Zambia, you find these Western countries that are pushing these agendas also rely on the same fossil fuels that are telling Zambia to not use. You know what I mean? So I guess one of the approaches that Access Horizons uses pretty much is a human-centered solutions, and we pretty much design solutions that are people-centered, people-conscious, empathetic towards people, and we do lobby with policymakers, having conversations with people, just trying to figure out exactly to say like, okay, you have a community-centered solution within this community. Do you realize that there's certain marginalized people that exist in that community? How can we include them in this programming, especially when we recognize that stigma and discrimination exist in these communities? How do we design interventions that are inclusive enough in your climate change mitigations? in order for everybody to have a holistic benefit of whatever interventions that will be designed at the end of the day. Yeah.
Well, so I'll tell you like this, because what I like about that is that you actually zoned in where you brought it in and you put it on the micro level. And see, I think putting it on the micro level is probably how a lot of policymakers or people in your government are looking at it, as though if you're just talking about this one segment of a population, where what most people, well, I'm going to say most people, but most of these countries, especially here, when you talk about climate change, it's on the macro level.
Exactly.
And so on the macro level means that there's a catch-all, which means everything is in there. And so because everything is in there, you don't get the funding or the necessities that in which you're talking about that you should get. Well, even if it's on the macro level or the micro level, it does not matter, because again, as being the marginalized and underserved community, it's like one of those frowned upon things where it's like, if funds are going to drip down, it sounds like you guys are going to be the last group that even comes into play, if it even comes into play. That's kind of like what it looks like here when we talk about climate change. The underserved and marginalized communities, especially Black communities, are not even close to even being thought about unless it's at the end, and that's when the world's coming to an end. And again, you want to use Black people to actually come and save the world, be Captain Save-A-Hose.
Exactly.
So it's like, what happens is, I love the way you framed that argument, but what I will tell you is that I think probably what will work best is that in the advocacy work that you do, and probably if you guys actually go to the policymakers that you talk to, you maybe want to frame it a little different to make it a little broader, and maybe then it'll start to fund in, where you guys start to get some of that funding that you're requesting, because it's definitely needed, and it's definitely one that if it does not happen, then it's probably one of those first groups or whatever have you that goes extinct.
Yeah. No, I totally hear you, but I guess maybe the biggest challenge is when you go to a policymaker and you're trying to describe to them who a marginalized person is. Now, to actually be able to break it down to these policymakers and be able to give them an opportunity to actually listen to you, you'll find that it's a topic that they don't want to touch. In as much as the conversation is not really about human rights or LGBTQ rights, we're talking about climate justice. But just the mere fact that you've mentioned certain people, certain minorities within the communities, they don't want to touch a conversation.
Exactly.
I guess maybe these conversations come with a lot of access. You need to have access in order to make a proper institutionalized change. Because at the end of the day, policy is only policy so long as it's implemented. Otherwise, it will always remain on paper. It will always remain on paper. And I guess maybe at the end of the day, ultimately, it's one of those things that platforms like yours give people, I guess, pressure.
Yes.
It gives people pressure to actually do something about it, because at the end of the day, people don't know there's a gay person who's lost their livelihood in whatever part of the country because the river has been polluted, or
Right.
the fishermen, or maybe there's a woman who lives in the most rural part of the country who, because of the mining company that's down the road, and now that mining company has affected um, the rainfall pattern in that area. Now they cannot subsistently farm. They don't care for those people. So now I guess maybe we need to be given an opportunity to actually put a face towards climate change, climate justice, because
Yes.
currently we're talking about climate justice. How can I put it? We're speaking about climate justice and climate change without actually referring to people who are actually affected by these aspects of global change. So now, who is willing to actually be the face of that? who is willing to be the face of the women's side of climate change and climate justice, who is willing to be and stand for LGBTQ people and say like, I'm affected by climate change in A, B, C, D sort of manner, because at the end of the day, the victimization of follow once someone identifies themselves as part of the community. So
Right.
it's a very interesting approach that we are still thinking around, and we're hoping that, I mean, we've done a couple of interventions here and there, but it's not enough. I mean, at the end of the day, when it comes to climate justice and climate change, it's never ever enough. Just a quick one. I want to ask you something. When we talk about Black communities and when we talk about marginalization, how do, in your opinion, how do you think marginalization is different from the Black African to the African American?
Basically, it's the same, but the difference in the two are it has a lot to deal with as when you talk about climate, like the climate situation that you mentioned. You
Mhm,
see, what makes it different is the density, and
mhm.
it's about the location and you know the effects of different things that go into that whole thing.
Yeah,
So, like, depending upon like, let's just say
yeah,
like I'm in Georgia,
yeah.
and let's say there are black people that live in Utah.
Hmm.
Now, see, you know, you wouldn't understand that, but I'll just say if you got black people that are living in Utah, you know that that looks totally different.
Hmm.
And when I say that looks totally different, it's
Hmm.
because the mountainous ranges out there, you know, where the air could be a little bit clear, which
Yeah,
is now starting to be polluted by all the manufacturers and things that they're doing out there that's polluting the air, that's starting
yeah,
to affect the water and the different things that different communities have. You know,
yeah.
now there's not really a large African American community out there.
Hmm.
They're there though. The thing about that is their issue wouldn't be the same as my issue here in Metro Atlanta.
Yeah.
Because here in Metro Atlanta, being as big and as broad as it is, basically this area of 11 counties
Yeah.
can make up a whole state on its own because there's more than 11 million people here.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so that's the difference in the two is that is what the makeup is. But even with that makeup being different, it's still with everything being done that you know that they make policy based on segmenting communities and disparaging people in different ways as to how they make their priorities. That doesn't
Uh-huh.
matter if it's just here. That's all over the world and wherever country you're in. That is
Yeah.
what they do. And so in doing that, it's like the principalities and the goals of that whole thing is to say that I know the strength of an African American, or a black person in general.
Hmm.
So you know they don't feel like everybody else feels, so they can survive regardless of the case. That's just the thought process.
I hear you. I hear you.
And so, with that being the case, that means that we all should know one thing, just like you guys should know this,
Yeah.
is that nobody's coming to save you.
That
If
is true.
anything, that repression that they have is only going to get closer and closer. And the more they can squeeze that, the more they're going to continue to do it. And
Hmm.
so, what I'm saying is, the work that you're doing is very important because I'm sure that not just those policymakers, but people know who you are and this
Exactly.
work that you're doing. So, in the process of knowing that, believe me, I can tell you this that there's an eye that's watching and they want to make sure that once you jump outside that line, somebody's
Uh,
going to be there and say, you jumped out the line.
That is true. That is true. That
That's
is
what
very,
happens. And
that is very,
so the thing is that it doesn't make it right. But what that means is that you're doing something that's right, that's making a difference, and they want to make sure they keep that under control. That's the
that is,
same here.
that is true. So just another question. So I mean, it's something that I touched on earlier on, but I just wanted to maybe get your just a little bit of your 2 cents on it. when we talk about the African perception, when people say LGBTQ rights in Africa, in Zambia, and whatever, a Western agenda. Speaking
Right.
as black man who's an ally, what would you say about that?
Well, I would just tell you again, it's one of those things where, we make our own path.
Yeah,
So when you make your own path, you just make sure, just like what you're doing, you make sure that you keep walking down your path and you don't have to
yeah,
worry about what's outside because they're worried about what's inside your path as large as they are. They're worried about what you're doing. And they're
that
worried
is
about what you're doing is because it's not what they consider to be the status quo because it's against what you want to do, which is for the people.
that is true.
So as long as you do what you do for the people, you don't have to worry about them. You just keep doing what you do.
No, no, but I wanted to hear from you as a black man when you hear people saying, when you hear people from Africa say things like homosexuality is a Western agenda, like what is the first thing that crosses your mind when you hear that? Like, what is your train of thought around that?
I'm sorry to say this, and people going they make me get upset with me, but I think of, and I'm sorry, I just think of slavery and white people. That's what I think of. That's what
Really?
I think of because that's about control. And so when they start speaking like that, they're only speaking like that because that means that they have an agenda that's against the good part or the good things. But I don't
Yeah,
care about those folk. And I always tell people you can't worry about what these other folk
yeah,
are going to be thinking. We know
yeah.
what they're thinking, so we plan against what they're thinking.
That is very, very, very true. Because at the end of the day, like you rightfully said, no one is coming in safe communities here. We
Right.
need to we need to be able to help ourselves in a way. But I guess at the end of the day, it also starts from a place of knowledge and information. I believe that once people know and people are aware, especially when it comes to constitutional mandates and legislature and things like that, once people are aware, they'll be able to stand up. And also, one of the biggest challenges that we have as a country and have as a region is freedom of speech.
Yes. Yes.
Advocacy is hard if you don't have protections from the freedom of speech. Because at the end of the day, the worry is that in as much as I'm advocating for my community, or the next person is advocating for their community, how am I protected? How am I
Well,
protected?
Well, I'll tell you like this. You see,
Mm,
the protections are far and few in between. They are real, but what happens is, when you do the type of work that you're doing,
yeah,
it's always going to be to an extent that, all the protections that are there for those things that you mentioned,
yeah,
they make them a little bit lesser for you because they don't give you that much rope.
that
Everybody
is
else get a whole lot of rope. You don't get that much rope.
that is true. And this is how come you'll find a lot of activists and advocates in Zambia decide to externalize their advocacy from countries where there's protections for freedom of speech,
Right.
because it's been like that for many years. That doing that in Zambia, doing that within Africa, whether get you victimized or might get you a prison sentence. And I mean, there's a couple of people who I might mention who, not in the realms of LGBTQ rights, but just in the realms of being able to speak freely, who've actually fled the country because they said a couple of things that certain people were not happy with. You get what I mean? So it's a very it's a you need to be bold. You need to be bold, and you need to be able to risk everything for you to actually reach a point of where your advocacy can transition your freedom pretty
Yes.
much.
Yes. And that's pretty much true. And it's horrible that it has to be that way. But I think that now that we're in this 21st century, revolts are all over the place. People that look like you and I
Yeah,
are basically doing what they do because it's like repression is no longer an option.
that is true. That's true.
It is no longer an option.
Power to indeed power to the
Yeah,
people.
yeah, because I also want to tell you this, because like I said, the work that you do,
Hmm.
I've had people on the show from other African countries as well that are part of the LGBTQ community that are doing big advocacy work. I definitely would love to have you back on the show, you and two of these other people, where we could talk about some upgrades and some things that are going on,
Sure.
to where there are some things where you guys were able to be connected, as well as the work that you're doing. You'll be able to learn from each other to continue to make to move and shake and to make things happen on the continuum. And I think these are some really good people, though, that I like to connect you
Yeah.
to, because they're doing really, really good work.
I mean, that sounds amazing. I mean, the more the merrier, because at the end of the day, I don't think advocacy should actually be done in isolation at the end of the day. I mean, we're a
Right.
whole community, it's a whole global movement, it's a whole global community, it's a whole continental community. And I always feel that the more the merrier, the more support, the more knowledge, the more the information, the better, because I don't think there's anyone out there in the world who's doing advocacy by themselves.
Right.
Because I mean, we don't live in a bubble. There's so many intersectional aspects of to our being who we are that we could learn from other people how to better address certain aspects of our community and how our society. So I'm always excited to collaborate. I'm always excited to learn and just be a part of the people.
So
Yeah.
let's do this. So in closing, do you have some words of wisdom and encouragement for our audience? Tell them how they can connect with you via social media. Tell them about your website, all those good things.
Okay, so we do have it's a pity that recently we've just been slacking from our social media, but what I will do is that at the end of this video, I'm hoping that on your YouTube channel, I'll be able to send you a link maybe within the bio. This is something that you can address, you can actually add on within the bio, my LinkedIn link, um, a YouTube link to a couple of things that we've done as well, an Instagram link to sort of a couple of social interventions that we've been a part of, and also a couple of reports that I will share a link to as well that we've actually done in the past couple of years. We've done some amazing work, documented work, and we've also been part of major country interventions that have supported close to 25,000 people to access HIV care services in the country. And we are excited to share that information with you. And we've had several partners who've helped us achieve these milestones. And so, yeah, I will be able to share those links. So, like the famous content creators love to say, link in the bio.
Right. By the way, there was a comment there in the chat that someone mentioned that they're not a part of the LGBTQ community, but they do support the LGBTQ community.
Uh-huh.
Yes, sir.
And
So after let me I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do a closing bio, say a
so,
closing monologue. But after I close the show, do you have a couple of minutes to stay around? A few minutes before we actually go all the way off the air.
sure, sure.
So for those of you that are watching the show and you've been here for the duration of the show, I want you to know that I appreciate you and your support. This was definitely a great show. Another great show, one that's got plenty of information and knowledge as to what is happening, not just here in Western culture, but what's happening around the world. This is a really good show for advocacy. And for those of you that are advocates, I do suggest that you do the work that you're doing and you keep doing it. And for those of you that want to support Ben and his organization, you'll be able to, if you go to the YouTube channel, America in Black and White, and you'll see the post, you'll see the connection links, and please connect with him and reach out to him.
Yeah.
So in closing, let me do this monologue. Benjamin Hyson Mutambo, thank you. Not with a polite, reflective television thank you, but with the kind of deep, bone level gratitude that you feel when someone has just given you something real. You came here tonight and you gave us the truth about what it means to be a young Black man in Zambia who has chosen not to be assigned, not drafted, not inherited, but chosen to stand at the intersection of every difficult, urgent conversation that your generation must have. You told us what it costs to defend LGBTQ plus rights in a country where the law itself is the adversary, where Section 155 of the colonial era penal code still hangs over the heads of people simply trying to live and love with dignity. You told us about HIV response work that does not flinch from the communities that stigma has most brutally abandoned, and what it looks like to insist that health equity is not achieved by managing symptoms, but by dismantling the structures that produce those symptoms in the first place. You told us about climate justice in a way that made it impossible to separate from human rights, from food, from water, from the very survival of communities that did not cause this crisis. You told us about digital justice and why internet access is not an amenity, but an architecture, the architecture through which opportunity is increasingly distributed or denied. And you told us about Access Horizons initiative, about what you built from conviction and community, about what you are still building, and about who you are building it for. We're better for this conversation. This show is better for the conversation. The world is better for the work you do. 3 things to stay with me to stay with me from tonight. First, the struggle for Black dignity, Black rights, and Black power is one global struggle. It does not have a headquarters in America and a branch office in Africa. It is the same fight rooted in the same colonial wound, animated by the same refusal to accept dehumanization, pointed towards the same horizon of a world where every Black person everywhere can live with full humanity. What Benjamin is doing in Zambia is what Fannie Lou Hamer did in Mississippi. What AHI is doing in Lusaka is what SNCC did in Selma. The geography changes, the struggle does not. Second, courage is not the absence of fear. It is a decision that something matters more than your fear. To advocate openly for LGBTQ plus rights in a community or in a country where your advocacy can put you in a prison cell requires a quality of courage that most of us will never be called to demonstrate. And Benjamin demonstrates it not dramatically, not for applause, but consistently, daily, quietly, because the people he serves needs him to. That kind of courage deserves our deepest respect and our most active support. Third, building something, a real institution with a real mission, with a real people in real communities, is one of the most radical acts available to us. Benjamin did not wait for the world to save his community. He built the vehicle. That is Black power in its most practical and most profound expression. I want to speak directly to you, to everyone watching from a position of relative safety tonight, from America, from the UK, from wherever you are in the diaspora, or wherever you are in the world, with a paycheck, a platform, a social media following, a professional network, a voice. What you witnessed tonight is not a spectacle. It is not a TED Talk. It is not inspirational content for your feed. It is a dispatch from the front line, a real one, where real people are navigating real danger, real exclusion, and real injustice with insufficient resources and more than sufficient courage. You're not being asked to solve everything. You're being asked to do something. Share this episode. Tell someone about Benjamin and Access Horizons Initiative. Look up to the LGBTQ rights landscape in Zambia, in Uganda, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Tanzania, in the countries where the people you saw in this conversation live and work and fight, and find ways to support the advocates on the ground. Put your money, your voice, your network, your skills behind the organizations that are doing this work without waiting for a global consciousness that they deserve to exist. Do not let this be a conversation you watched and then forgot. Let it be a conversation that changed what you do next. Share this episode everywhere you can. Comment below. Let us know what moved you, what challenged you, and what you're going to do next. Follow and support Access Horizons Initiative in every way available to you. And keep coming back, because every week, America in Black and White is here with the conversations that this country and this world urgently needs to have. Until next time, keep speaking truth, keep serving with purpose, and never forget your story is America's story. I'm Charles Zachary King, and it's been America in Black and White. You all have a great evening, and please come back and watch us again tomorrow evening for another great episode as we go through Black history and Egyptian history. We will see you guys tomorrow night.